So they'll all get you guys will all get a message you'll have to respond to about recording. Okay. Okay, so welcome everyone to our event titled Israel and Gaza, the Question of Genocide, International Law, and the Struggle for Palestinian Liberation, with guest speaker, Dr. Raz Segal. My name is Kathy Pfister, and I'm a member of the Palestine-Israel Justice Team of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of San Diego. Our justice team, which organized this event, strives to work within the First UU church community to inform and mobilize individuals and leaders to recognize and help counter inequality and injustice in Palestine-Israel, and to support our allies in the justice and anti-oppression communities. We envision a just peace in Palestine-Israel that reflects our UU values of respect for the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, as well as justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. This event is co-sponsored by Unitarian Universalists for Justice in the Middle East, an independent organization of UUs from around the US, working within the wider UU community to advocate for a just peace in Palestine-Israel. So we'll have a question and answer session after Dr. Segal's presentation. So if you have a question, you can type it in the chat and he will answer it at that time after the presentation. You can also raise your hand electronically after the presentation and we'll call on you to unmute yourself and ask your question. So if everyone could keep themselves on mute during the presentation, then that would help minimize noise and distractions for our speaker and attendees. So we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Raz Segal as our guest speaker for tonight's event. Dr. Segal is Associate Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and Endowed Professor in the Study of Modern Genocide at Stockton University in New Jersey. He has held both Harry Frank Guggenheim and Fulbright fellowships and was recently a senior fellow at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies. His publications include Genocide in the Carpathians, War, Social Breakdown, and Mass Violence, 1914 to 1945, and Days of Ruin, the Jews of Munkat during the Holocaust. He was guest editor of the Hebrew language special issue on Genocide, Mass Violence, and Cultural Erasure of Zmanim, a historical quarterly. Dr. Segal is at work on 2 new books. One provides a critical account of the history and memory of Holocaust bystanders, while the other offers a new analysis of Israeli mass violence from the 1948 Nakba to the current assault on Gaza. In addition to his scholarly publications, Dr. Segal has published op-eds, book reviews, and larger articles on genocide, state violence, and memory politics in Hebrew, English, and German in The Guardian, LA Times, The Nation, Jewish Currents, Haaretz, plus 972 magazine, and Berliner Zeitung, and has appeared on Counterpoints, Al Jazeera English, Democracy Now!, and ABC News. Welcome, Dr. Segal.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for everyone joining. You know, I'm going to try to cover a number of things, and we'll see how much I get to, and perhaps at some point I'll stop and we'll open it for discussion. Maybe some of the issues I can address in discussion, but I do want to just to give you a general sense of my agenda. I do want to present you briefly the definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention, and then lay out the argument, again, quite briefly, for genocide in the case of Israel's attack on Gaza. I want to talk about a bit of historical background, specifically settler colonialism in the case of Israel, which is very important to understand what's going on around us today. Hopefully we'll have time to talk a bit about what's going on around us right now, the encampments, the Gaza Solidarity encampments on US campuses and their significance. And in that context, also perhaps say a few words about the weaponization of anti-Semitism. So the depiction of these encampments as somehow hotbeds of anti-Semitism. And say a few things also along the way of what we can do perhaps in the face of these momentous processes and events that are unfolding in front of our eyes. So I'll start and let's see how much we get through. And again, maybe at some point I'll stop. I'll try to speak now, Kathy, if it's okay, for maybe 35 minutes or so, and then open it up for the discussion. But let's see where we are in the next half hour.
Yeah, that should be fine.
Okay. All right. So very briefly, again, the Genocide Convention, which includes the only definition of the crime of genocide, right? From 1948, the convention. There's a lot to say about the convention. There's a lot to say about the convention that is actually very relevant for our purposes as well, but we don't have time for that. What's important to understand is that genocide as a crime in international law is not something that needs to look like the Holocaust or however we imagine the Holocaust, because actually most people, of course, for very good reason, don't know a lot about the Holocaust. They imagine the Holocaust in various ways because it's a very important marker of identity in the West, and it's a lot of popular culture and films and theater and art about the Holocaust. But however we imagine the Holocaust or whatever we know about the Holocaust is actually, in any case, not relevant to how the crime of genocide is defined in international law, right? And this is the only accepted definition that we have, and that's the definition that we work with in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. And you can see it here. So genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And there are 5 acts of genocide. You can also see that, genocide occurs. So there are 2 key components of this definition. One, of course, is the intent, and it's important to say that we imagine international law as a hierarchy, right? And this kind of idea, for example, that genocide is the crime of crimes. So there's a hierarchy of crimes, but there isn't actually a hierarchy of crimes in international law. There's different crimes with different elements, right? And it's not that, war crimes are less horrible than the crime of genocide. They're different kind of crimes, right? And of course, for the victims themselves, it doesn't really matter, right? That's very important to keep in mind, the perspective of those facing state violence. But intent is one of the elements that differentiates genocide from other crimes. Intent is very important. It's usually very, very difficult to prove, okay? And that's the reason that we have very, very few cases of recognized genocide since 1948. And we can think about the Rwanda genocide, of course, in 1994, the Srebrenica massacre. So from all the wars and mass violence in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, only the Srebrenica massacre in 1995 is recognized as a case of genocide. And there's a couple other here and there, but very, very few, because the issue of intent is so difficult to prove. It's important to say right here that the Israeli case, Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, is actually quite exceptional already here because of the clear, direct, and unashamed expressions of intent from the very beginning, from October 7th. And we're not talking here, just about expressions at the heat of the moment and the week after October 7th. We're talking about dozens and dozens of expressions of genocidal intent by people what's called an international law command authority, so state leaders, war cabinet ministers, and senior army officers, right? Expressing intent in clear ways. We'll give some examples here in a bit, but there are dozens of them. And Law for Palestine, I urge you to take a look. Law for Palestine has actually documented on its website these dozens of expressions of genocidal intent. It has actually documented hundreds of cases of incitement to genocide. So incitement, it's anything that we have in the media, in politics that is not command authority, right? In social media. So there's a lot of incitement to genocide in Israel today, hundreds of cases, right? But there's also dozens of genocidal intent, right? So this is very exceptional. We might want to think actually, why? Why have Israeli leaders, until today, just today, by the way, and maybe I can read you that very briefly. Israel's Minister of Finance, Bezalel Smotrich, who's a settler, of course, and who also doubles basically as the de facto governor of the occupied West Bank, yesterday, said the following in a holiday. It's just Passover just ended, and it was a holiday lunch, and he said the following: moments before redemption, we must not hesitate. We must destroy Rafah, Nusret, and Dir al-Balach, wipe out the memory of Amalek. There's no half measure. Rafah, Dir al-Balach, Nusret, absolute destruction, right? This is today, right? It's more than 6.5 months after 7th of October, after the International Court of Justice hearings and provisional measures and more provisional measures. And so this is just from today. And again, there's dozens of them. We will say a bit more about this. But intent, genocidal intent in the Israeli case is well established. Then we have the dynamics of violence. And it's enough that with intent, we have one or more, but it's enough that there's one of the 5 acts of genocide that we have genocide, okay? Now, killing members of the group, of course, is one of them, but you don't have to have systematic mass murder to have genocide, right? Of course, it's important to say that the numbers in the Israeli case are already extremely high. Israel has killed so far in its attack over 35,000 Palestinians. There's more than 10,000, at least, under the rubble, most likely dead. There's more than 80,000 Palestinians wounded, many of them severely. There's about 2 million Palestinians forcibly displaced, and Israel has targeted everything in the Gaza Strip. Everything, I mean everything. So all the universities, I mean, if we talk about the encampments on US campuses today, we have to remember that Israel has destroyed all the universities in Gaza. Hundreds of schools, churches. It has wiped out, by the way, the Palestinian Christian community in Gaza, which was ancient and very, very important. Churches, mosques, residential buildings, of course, archives, libraries, whole neighborhoods, agricultural fields. From the very beginning, Israel has bombed agricultural fields where there was nothing there but agricultural fields. It tells us something about the dynamics of violence, right? Now, one of the things that is very clear from the dynamics of violence is that Israel's violence very much falls within the 3rd kind of genocidal acts, that is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Okay, we'll get to that in just a minute. So just to sum up this piece, right? Intent and dynamics of violence, according to the definition, right? In the Israeli case, really gives us, also because of the levels of destruction, right, that we see in front of our eyes, right, gives us what I called quite early on in my article in Jewish Currents on 13th of October, really a textbook case of genocide. Now let's lay out the some of the examples. So we see what we're talking about here. So Israel's president, Herzog, and these are very well-known examples, but it's worth repeating them, right? It's also time goes on by. We're already more than 6 months into this genocidal assault, but you will probably remember that Israel's president, in a press conference in English on 13th of October, described all the Palestinians in Gaza as responsible, quote unquote, for the Hamas-led attack on 7th of October. And he said it's an entire nation out there that is responsible. And he said more, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true. This is 13th of October, right? He's talking about 2.3 million Palestinians, half of whom, it's important to say, are children, legally, that is under the age of 18, right? Now, on 9th of October, before that, we have Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant proclaiming total siege and referring to Palestinians as human animals. Now, total siege in itself, right, that is depriving the population of food, water, fuel, medical supplies, essentials for life, right? Now, keep in mind, as we know, all of this we know, by the way, right now, I'm not telling you anything that we don't know here, right? Keep in mind that this is exactly what Israel has done. It has created famine in Gaza, right? It has led to everything that happens in famine, right? So starvation, malnutrition, long-term horrific effects of all of this. We don't have time to go into any of this. Outbreak of infectious disease. And of course, at a time when Israel has intentionally destroyed the entire medical infrastructure of Gaza, right? Including invading hospitals, execution sites in hospitals, as we now know more and more, the mass murder of hundreds of healthcare workers, doctors, nurses. So this, of course, exacerbates, right? And indeed points to Article 2C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And again, I want to mention the numbers right here that are already very significant, tens of thousands of victims. So Yoav Gallant. Now, some people said that maybe Gallant referred only to Hamas. Now, Israeli President Herzog already told us that everyone is responsible in Gaza. But the next day after the total siege proclamation, the Israeli coordinator of the government activities in the occupied territories, Major General Hassan Aliyan, made it very clear in a video message recorded specifically for the people of Gaza who human animals refers to. And he said the following. He said, Hamas has turned into ISIS, and the residents of Gaza, instead of being appalled or celebrating, human animals must be treated as such. There will be no electricity and no water. There will only be destruction. You wanted hell, you will get hell. So this, again, very explicit, very direct, doesn't really leave a lot of room for speculation. Now, one of the things that we see with human animals, of course, is dehumanization, which is a very clear mechanism of genocidal violence, right? And there are other ways in which Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been dehumanized. One of the key ways in which we see dehumanization is the portrayal of Palestinians as Nazis. So in this weaponization of the Holocaust, right, and the weaponization of discourse of anti-Semitism, which have a history well before the 7th of October, right? It's enough if we remember that Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin in 1982, when Israel bombed and destroyed parts of Beirut in Lebanon, right, portrayed Yasser Arafat, right, the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, in Beirut at the time as Hitler in his bunker in Berlin, right? So the weaponization of the Holocaust has a deep history in Israeli politics and society. And of course, again, we don't have time to go into it, but it became very, very operative after 7th of October. And it functions to, as again, actually Yoav Gallant said already on the 9th of October to Israeli troops, right, that he releases all restraints in the Israeli army operations in Gaza, for example, because if the fight is against Nazis, right, then everything is permitted, right? There is no international law. This also gives us an idea of why we see these expressions of intent, right? Because Israelis imagine that they're fighting Nazis, right? Now, on 13th of January, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded to the initiation of the procedure in the International Court of Justice, the South Africa application against Israel for the crime of genocide. And he said that, very typical, he said, we don't care, this is not, nothing will stop us. But in that speech, he told Israelis a story. The story was that Israeli soldiers had found a tablet in Gaza of a little girl with Hitler as its screensaver. Now, the thing is that there is no evidence for such a thing, not even in the Israeli media. Now, anyone who is following the Israeli media since 7th of October in Hebrew has been exposed to really unbelievable levels of, as I said, incitement to genocide in various ways. Nothing like this has surfaced. A little girl with a tablet of Hitler's as its screensaver. Now, this is 13th of January in response to the ICJ, right? Netanyahu uses a very genocidal image to talk to Israelis, specifically relating to children, to Palestinian children, which, it's important to say, Israel has now killed nearly 15,000 Palestinian children. And we know, by the way, that the targeting of children, and when you kill 15,000 children, it's not an accident, right? The targeting of children also points to genocidal dynamics, right? So he used, right, genocidal language, a portrayal again of Palestinians and Nazis, and specifically in a very painful way, the portrayal of Palestinian children as Nazis. Now, it's important to say that the weaponization of the Holocaust is really a world turned upside down, because what we have is a nuclear power, Israel, right? A nuclear power backed by Western powers, and especially the United States, right? Which is, of course, the reason for the encampments on US campuses, right? Students are saying, we want our government and our universities to stop their support of an unfolding genocide, right? That's the reason for the encampments. But Israel has the support, has nuclear power, a very powerful army, right? And it's a state, of course. There's a big difference between a state and a people, that is Jews and Israel. We're talking about a state here, right? 21% of its citizens, by the way, least we forget, are Palestinians, the citizens. There's also millions of Palestinians under occupation. So it takes this state, powerful state, and turns it into the ultimate victims in modern imagination, attacked by Palestinians who are now portrayed as the ultimate perpetrators, even though they have experienced decades and decades and decades under Israeli settler colonialism, military occupation, siege. It's important, of course, to remember that Galland could proclaim a total siege, right, on 9th of October, because Gaza was under siege, right, under siege for 16 years before, right? That's why Galland had to say total siege, because siege was already there, right? Now, this is one more thing that it's important to say before we move to say just a few words about this background about settler colonialism, uh, is that a lot of people say, well, you know, Israel warns the Palestinians, right? It issues evacuation orders, right? These kinds of things. So, which is very much in line with international humanitarian law, right? That you're supposed to evacuate the civilians from fighting areas. But we know, here I'd like to, just a second. Oh, here it is. So we know that, and we know that on the 13th of October, when Israel issued its first evacuation order, right, ordering more than a million Palestinians to evacuate from the north to the southern part of Gaza immediately, right? Then in that moment and in the coming weeks, it used its most heaviest bombs, US made, of course, to bomb precisely the routes that it designated as safe and the south, where it told Palestinians to flee. And we know this because even a very, very important investigative reporting piece in the New York Times laid this out for us in great detail at the end of the 21st of December. But we also know this because we have testimonies of Palestinians. Right now, I'm, as you know, I'm a Jew, I'm an Israeli, I'm a scholar of the Jewish world, I'm a scholar of the Holocaust, and I'm a scholar of genocide. For me, the perspective of those who face state violence, right, is central as a methodological concern, as an ethical concern, to listen to the voices, to the perspectives, to the knowledge of those who face state violence. Now, what are the testimonies that we have? From the 7th of October, Palestinians have been texting, sending voice messages, and there's a lot of them. Some of them have been translated and uploaded online in various collections. But I want to read you just one, about this issue of the safe routes and safe places. It's by a person that we'll call A. He's a journalist and translator. He was, at least. It's not clear if he's still alive. And he conveyed the terror of the beginning of Israel's unfolding attack and the first few days in a voice message to a friend on 15th of October. And he said the following. He said, "I'm still in my home in Gaza City. Many people have fled to the south," right? This is 2 days after the evacuation order. People have already started to flee massively. "But many stayed here in the north after they saw the massacre of 70 people and more than 200 injured on the road to the south," right? So on a safe route. People got scared, including the people who had intended to flee, right? But then when they heard the news about the massacre, he says they decided to stay here. And then after that, there was so much bombing in the south, so much bombing and bombing and bombing, massacres, so many people martyred, so many people killed. That is to say, people left Gaza City, went to the south, and sought shelter with people there, and then they all got shelled. You even have people who fled to the south and came back to Gaza City. There's a lot of these accounts, okay? So we know from testimonies on the ground that we have here, again, just to return to the definition, we have here deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, the evacuation orders, right, combined with the targeting of people on the safe routes and in the safe places, and this is something that has been repeated since the 13th of October in other evacuation orders. That's why we have so many casualties, right? It's not a mistake. We have these accounts, we have, and as I said, even investigative reporting pieces like the one published in the New York Times on the 24th and the 21st of December. And we also know from these testimonies that because of the 16-year-old siege, right, people in Gaza, immediately after the 9th of October proclamation of the total siege, very quickly started to feel its effects. So they were also ordered to flee, right, facing massive shortages of food and clean water and medical supplies. Now, I'm not even talking about, right, pregnant women, the sick, the hospitals, and we know what happened in the hospitals eventually, right? So the total siege with the evacuation orders that were not actually evacuation orders, right? They were indeed, right, inflicting conditions calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group, right? We have starvation today. We have, and Gaza looks like what genocide looks like. So I'll stop here with this part, and I'll just stop sharing for a minute, and I'll switch to I'm looking at the time, Kathy, but I do want to say just a few more words if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
So switch here quickly just to all right. Now, why is settler colonialism so important in this story? Okay. I mean, people sometimes talk about the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? These kinds of things. It's not a conflict, right? It's not a conflict because we have the relations of settler colonialism here. That is, we have colonizers and we have colonized. Now, if you don't want to listen to Palestinians who've been talking about settler colonialism and writing about settler colonialism for a long time, and you don't want to listen to Israeli scholars who've been talking and writing about this for a long time, and to other scholars, right? Then listen to Zionists. And one of the texts that I urge all of you to take a look at is Zev Jabotinsky, who's the father of revisionist Zionism, right? And his seminal text from 1923, The Iron Wall, which you can find an English translation online in the Jabotinsky Institute. It's short and it's very clear. It's an internal discussion among Zionists where Jabotinsky, who was right-wing Zionist, is arguing with left-wing Zionists at the time. And the argument is about settler colonialism. Jabotinsky tells his Zionist colleagues, he says, look, what are you talking about? We are coming to that place to take the land of people who are there. So he argues against this Zionist idea of a land without a people for a people without a land. He says, no, there are people there. And he asks his Zionist colleague, he says, do you know of any other case of colonization, right, where the indigenous group accepted colonization? And the answer is, of course not. And so he tells them, and the text is so very explicit, right? He says, colonization, he says, can have only one aim, to take their land, right? And Palestinian Arabs, he calls them Palestinians, cannot accept this aim. Zionist colonization, therefore, must either stop or else proceed regardless of the native population. Okay? Very explicit, very clear. Now, this is what happened, by the way, because in 1948, when Israel was established, there was immediately the Nakba in the 1948 war, right? That is, there was also a war with Arab armies, but in the context of this war, right, the emerging Israeli state conducted a large-scale ethnic cleansing campaign with the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians, the destruction of hundreds of villages and towns, massacre of 15,000 Palestinians, right? This is what happened, right? Now, of course, because Israel emerged together with the idea of the Holocaust as unique, Israel, which was the land where a lot of Holocaust survivors tried to build their life, also became unique in the emerging international legal and political system. So the Nakba, which is Israel's foundational crime, had to be immediately denied. And Nakba denial became structural in Israel and in all of the West, actually, right? Which makes it very interesting, okay, that after 7th of October, Israelis have moved from Nakba denial, and Nakba denial in Israel recently has been also in law. There's a Nakba law that criminalizes the acknowledgement of the Nakba. After 7th of October, we have a move to acknowledge the Nakba in the context of calling for a second Nakba, what's happening in Gaza now. And these are just two examples here that you can see on the screen. One is very well known. Both of them actually are very well known. Ariel Kalner was a member of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, from the ruling Likud party on 7th of October on social media, right? Said very, again, straightforward and explicit, Nakba to the enemy now, Nakba that will overshadow the Nakba of 48, right? Which is exactly actually what happened, right? Very quickly, what Avi Dichter then on 11th of November here on Israeli TV, again, openly and unashamed, called the Gaza Nakba, right, has far exceeded actually right now the 1948 Nakba, right? And it's important to say that already on 13th of October, we have the leaked document from Israel's Ministry of Intelligence, right, that tells us that the Israeli government was planning, right, the complete forced displacement, what we call the ethnic cleansing of all the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. This is 13th of October. What does this mean? It's less than a week after 7th of October, that it wasn't planned in the week after 7th of October, right? This is an inherent element of the Israeli state, right? The creation of a Jewish state for Jews without Palestinians. That's why settler colonialism is an important element to understand in this history. Now, again, there's so much more to say about all of this. And maybe let me, again, we can talk a bit more about, I already see that there's a lot of questions. I do want to say some more things, and I'll find a way to say them about the encampments, about the weaponization of anti-Semitism. Let's stop here. Let's open it up for discussion and see where we go. Is that good, Kathy?
Yeah, that's fine. It's a good time, I think. So I'm just going through, trying to find the questions in the chat. Okay, so here's one. Do you think this situation would have been different had Hamas released the hostages?
Okay. I'm just scrolling down to see if there's other questions that I can combine. Okay, so let me say something about the hostages, and then we can address some more questions. I mean, it's important to say, and I've actually, since that first article that I wrote on 13th of October in Jewish Currents, I was very clear that the Hamas that attacked on 7th of October was horrendous war crime, and crimes against humanity, including forced disappearances, the hostage taking, which is an ongoing crime, of course, and a case of mass murder, obviously, right? The Hamas attack on 7th of October. Now, the massive tragedy of the hostages, as we've seen since 7th of October, is that the Israeli government, unfortunately, does not care about them at all, right? It has refused significant deals. There's this one deal in the ceasefire that they had, but it refused significant deals one after the other. We're not even sure how many of the 133 hostages now, allegedly in the hands of Hamas and others, are actually still alive. But what's clear is that the Israeli government, the hostages are very, very low on its priority list. And the reason for that is that the goal of this attack on Gaza was never to manage to rescue and return the hostages. The goal was to destroy Gaza, and as I said, to create what Israeli leaders said that they were creating, a second Nakba, a Gaza Nakba, right? The hostages have nothing to do with this. We actually know that Israel's actions in the Gaza Strip have killed hostages, sometimes directly, right? In cases that unfortunately have been well documented, right? So the hostages, and of course, we now know that in demonstrations in the streets of Israel, now already, the police are actually beating up the families of the hostages who are protesting, right? So the hostages are a horrible tragedy, right? And discussing them also tells us something about the goals of the Israeli military. Mind you, Israel has declared two goals for its attack on Gaza. One is to free the hostages, right? Which it has not done, certainly not in a military way, only through a ceasefire, actually, right? And the other was to destroy Hamas, which it has also not done, right? So it begs the question, more than 6.5 months into this, what is actually the goal of Israel's attack on Gaza? Well, it's what it looks like. It's genocide. Kathy, do you want us to maybe take some of the questions with the hands up?
Yeah, why don't we go to those next? I think they're next. So Michael Lehman, why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question? You're muted. Oh, maybe
Yeah,
maybe he didn't want. Oh, sorry.
With all due respect, it's such a one-sided Jew-hating lecture. The fact is, one must look at the map and see what the Muslim movement around the world is. It stretches from China to Morocco, and on both sides, 1.5 billion people calling themselves brothers, and they never could accommodate their brothers. There was mass movement of populations everywhere in the world. Israel is just a tiny little spot. You have to use a magnifying glass to check it out. From the beginning of Israel, there were 5 nations trying to eliminate it. So please be more than one-sided. Thank you.
So this is a good opportunity, I think, to say something about the weaponization of anti-Semitism, because as you all heard, I was just referred to as a Jew hater. Even though I'm an Israeli and a Jew, a Holocaust scholar with Holocaust survivors in my family, and of course, everything I said here is fully documented and based on facts, right, on the reality in front of our eyes, none of this matters. We can throw Jew hater, we can throw anti-Semite, and hope that this will end the discussion. Well, this also has a very deep history, of course, the weaponization of anti-Semitism, but it's not working these days anymore, because we return the discussion not to these kinds of things that are thrown around, but to the facts. One of the facts, for example, is that anti-Zionism, right, and criticism of Israel, but anti-Zionism is as old as Zionism, and it was an absolutely legitimate position in the Jewish world, and in times widespread, right? Many Jews have and are have been and are anti-Zionists, right? Many Jews have critiqued the state of Israel for decades of absolutely clear violations of international law, right? And conducted with impunity and supported by the West, primarily the US, right? Now, throwing around Jew hater and anti-Semitism is not going to help us deal with the situation. It's not going to help us think, actually, about a future in that place for everyone, Jews and Palestinians, right? I grew up in that place. I care about that place deeply, deeply, right? We're not going to be able to think about what happens there next if we continue, right, throwing these kinds of senseless things like Jew hater, right, which clearly I'm not, right, instead of engaging with facts, even if they're very uncomfortable, even if they're facts that we don't want to deal with, that we rather deny or push aside, right? And one more thing about this, right, because again, this is an opportunity to say something about the encampments. Just a few minutes and we'll turn to another question. But the discourse today that the encampments are hotbeds of anti-Semitism, right? Which has been expressed across the political spectrum by Democrats and Republicans, by the president, by President Biden, right? There are many Jews in these encampments. They have organized Passover seders. They have organized Shabbat services. They are Jews who are very visibly Jews. They walk with kippah. They pray. There are prayers in these encampments. Now, this is a very horrendous discourse now, because the discourse that the encampments are anti-Semitism actually refers to these Jews, right, not as Jews. So this is a new intensification of the discourse of the weaponization of anti-Semitism. Now, it's not, again, this is rooted in the Jewish world, and there's an irony here, right? Because the irony is that in the Jewish world, the argument that some Jews are not really Jews was wielded by Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox rabbis against Zionists. This is well before the Holocaust, because Zionists threatened to lure, right, Jews from Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities, right? Zionists who were in many cases secular, right? So one of the ways to discredit them was to say they're not even Jews, right? Now, Zionists are those who are wielding, right? Zionists and their supporters wielding this argument. But the key problem with this argument is, and the absurdity. Now, we live in an era of absurdities, so there's a lot of absurdities in front of our eyes all the time. But there's a key absurdity with this argument, is that it argues that you can only be a Jew if you're a Zionist and you support Israel, whatever it does, right? This is horribly an anti-Semitic idea, that all Jews are the same and can only be the same, right? It's an anti-Semitic idea, right? So the weaponization of the discourse of anti-Semitism, and this is not surprising, actually, this is not surprising, falls into into very real anti-Semitism, because look at the people who are wielding it. If we think about Elise Stefanik, right, in the House Committee on Education and the Workforce that's attacking university now and the encampments, right? This is a person who is, you know, has ties to white supremacists and has shared publicly on social media her positions on, for example, replacement theory, right? That Jews are helping to bring refugees into this country in order to destroy white people, right? This kind of thing, which is rooted in 150 years of white supremacist, anti-Semitic thinking. So it's not surprising, right, when white supremacists and anti-Semitism are actually wielding very cynically the discourse of anti-Semitism to shut down critique of Israel, to shut down critique of the US, to shut down critique of US support for genocide, and to shut down critique of the US universities' complicity with genocide, right, through companies that they have ties with, right? Then of course, we have here a very absurd and a very dangerous situation because, of course, this diverts attention from very real anti-Semitism that comes from the right, not from the encampments where there's a lot of Jews there who are not at all threatened, right? Shall we just go according to the hands up, Kathy? Sohel, I see now, and then Lean.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fine. And please, everybody, keep your questions brief if you can, and to be respectful for other people so we can get in as many questions as we can. Sohel, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah. So thank you, Professor, for your lecture. Even though I agree with Michael Lehman that, I mean, okay, Israel doing something wrong doesn't mean that the state of Israel is a bad country. It's different. We have governments change. The problem is I'm from a Muslim culture, from a Muslim background. So I can understand what was wrong in your lecture, Professor. For example, there are no Jews in Iraq, yet Iraqis are killing each other and destroying their own country. Syria, Yemen, Libya, Sudan is in a civil war. Egypt is almost going the same way. The problem, I believe, is in the Arab Muslim culture. The Jewish culture has gone through many changes throughout centuries. Like, even imagine, Josephus was talking about democracy and theocracy and philosophy in the first century, that before Islam by 500 years. We should not blame Israel for everything. I understand that you are criticizing your own.
Sohel, do you have a question?
Yeah, I will ask one question.
So please come to the question.
Yeah,
because
I will get there. Just one moment.
Can we move to someone else? This is really tedious and not why we're here.
Yeah, could
I ask
you,
respectfully, this isn't what's supposed to be happening, and it's not appropriate.
Sohel, could you please ask a question very quickly, please?
Yeah, my question is, okay, if Israel has Arabic names for all the streets, they have 2 million Arab people living there, and yet there is zero Jewish person inside the Palestinian culture. How will you build a solution, like two states solution? Yeah, that's my question.
So the fact is, actually, Sohail, is that there's nothing culturally specific about any group in the world that makes it inclined to violence. Actually, the Holocaust happened in Europe, not in the Muslim or Arab worlds, right? It was the European Christians who planned and carried out the genocide of the Jews, right? That didn't happen under Muslim or Arab culture.
It did happen. It did happen.
Well, I listened to you. I'd like to answer, please. Thank you. So that's one thing to say. European imperialism and colonialism around the world has destroyed cultures for hundreds of years, right? From British genocide in India to British genocide in Tasmania, where, by the way, in 30 years, the British wiped out a culture that had existed for thousands of years, actually. 5,000 people that existed on the island of Tasmania for thousands of years. In 30 years, it was wiped out, right, in British colonialism. Yes, there are Jews who live among Palestinians. They're called settlers. They're settlers that the state settled there. Almost 1 million Jews now live in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, was a crude violation of international law, right? meant specifically to continue the theft of land, right? In the frame of settler colonialism, right? Now, yes, we have almost 2 million Palestinian Israelis, Palestinian citizens of Israel. They have been, from the beginning, by the way, from 48, held under military rule until 1966, right? Those who survived the Nakba and remained in Israel, 156,000 people at the time, right? And afterwards have been held in various ways of second-class citizenship, embodied in the Israeli Basic Law of the Nation-State Law in 2018, because Israel doesn't have a constitution, as you might know. It has basic laws. In 2018, the state has been so explicit in its settler colonial approach that it enacted a basic law, the new Jewish nation-state basic law, that is an explicit settler law that, again, completely relegates Palestinian Israelis to second-class status, denies their belonging to their homeland. That was their homeland. It still is their homeland, right? And actually demotes Arabic, if you want to talk about names, and we can say a lot about names, actually, but we don't have time, right, to second-class status. It's not an official language anymore in Israel. So again, there's much more to say about this, but I think we'll move on to another question here. We have
So I'm going to take, how about another question from the chat? So here it is. As the major supplier of Israeli weaponry, is the United States implicated as a genocidal partner?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the reason for the encampments. It's also important to say that there was a case in California against the Center for Constitutional Rights, filed a lawsuit against President Biden and Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin for complicity to genocide, according to the Genocide Convention. According to the Genocide Convention, right, states that are party to the convention, like the United States, right, it's enough that there's a risk of genocide, that means that it activates the convention, which means that you cannot be complicit in the genocide, for example, by supplying unbelievable amounts of arms to Israel after, of course, a lot before 7th of October and after 7th of October, also without congressional hearings and so on and so forth, everything that we know, of course, right? And you are actually obligated, according to international law, if you're party to the convention, to prevent the genocide. So the Center for Constitutional Rights filed a lawsuit in California. The hearing in federal court actually took place on the day of the ICJ ruling, the provisional ruling, in the 26th of January. That was later that day, basically, in California. That was the hearing in the Center for Constitutional Rights case. And it was very, very important in a number of ways. The judge allowed, for example, for Palestinians to testify in federal court, and they testified for more than 3 hours. I urge you to take a look. It's all online. You can check, you can look through the website of the Center for Constitutional Rights. There's links to all of this. And the Palestinians who testified there testified about their family histories in Gaza. These are people from Gaza, and there were also included people in Gaza right now. A doctor from Rafah, for example, testified via Zoom. They said the word Nakba, I think, more than we've heard the word Nakba, combined until then in U.S. institutions and courts, right? Now, the judge eventually decided to reject the case on procedural grounds because he said that the court cannot intervene in foreign policy decision-making of the U.S. government. There's a whole legal debate that I'll save you, right? It's very complicated, and there's a big debate about it. The judge eventually decided that the court cannot intervene in foreign affairs decision-making processes, but he issued an incredibly important ruling. And he said that based on the testimonies of the Palestinians that he heard, And there was also an expert opinion, which is very important. It was Professor Barry Trachtenberg, who's a Jew, a scholar of the Holocaust and of Nazi Germany, who came to testify, right, about Israeli genocide, right? And the judge said that Barry Trachtenberg's testimony, that the testimonies of the Palestinians and the ruling of the International Court of Justice that day, right? For him, it's clear that there is a plausible case for genocide, that there is at least a risk of genocide, right? And he implores the defendants, that is Biden, Blinken, and Austin, to seize, that he can't tell them legally, right? But he implores them, a federal judge in the US, to seize their support of Israel. Of course, what the US government has done since then is increase its support of Israel, and that's why we have these encampments. But yes, the US government is absolutely complicit. Now, there's also very direct, maybe you know that the University of Pennsylvania here in Philadelphia, where I live, right, is the place where the robot dogs that have been weaponized and Israel is using now, it's a genocidal assault in Gaza, are developed on the University of Pennsylvania campus, right? So these kind of direct links and issues of complicity that have actually that might have international legal ramification on an individual basis for people. So yes, the answer is absolutely yes for that.
Okay, why don't we go to Lynn Segal? Can you unmute yourself and ask a question, please? Lynn, are you there? You're still muted if you're trying to talk. Okay, well, let's see. Michael's already asked a question, so let's go to Carl Hansen. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, actually, this is Davida Hutchell. Carl is visiting, and we were both listening. But rather than pointing fingers, why can we not lift hands and, with all the power that you were talking about, that the Europe and the US have, use that power to enable Palestinians to create a state for them, and not only create a state, but create an infrastructure where it makes it palatable for them to have their own state, where they're not, and not that I necessarily, when we say a Palestinian or Israeli state, I don't believe that you can't have other groups with equal power there, but for the sense of simplicity, dividing it right now into the two-state solution, perhaps on the Sinai Peninsula.
Well, if we have nearly 1 million Jewish settlers who have been settled in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem by the Israeli state for decades, with US support and with full impunity, right, by Israel's allies, this is for decades in front of our eyes. It's not new. It's all in our lifetime. It's in my lifetime, and I'm 48, so I'm not that old, right? What does that tell us about the nature of the Israeli state and its allies? Are they interested?
Two sections.
Are they interested in a two-state solution? If they were, they would have stopped the settler project well before the 7th of October. But they're not, right? Because as I said, Israel's a settler colonial state that's premised on the destruction of Palestinians. There is no interest in a Palestinian state, right? Now, that doesn't mean we are in a watershed moment now. Israeli impunity in international law, which has been a defining factor of international law actually since 48, as I said, Nakba denial. Think about it, right? Nakba denial, right? Could there be any future, by the way, without truth? Think about, I'm a scholar of the Holocaust, as I said, right? Think about this idea of truth that is one of the major lessons of the Holocaust, right? So we have to come to terms with a history that's very painful to come to terms with. And someone asked me here on the chat, I saw a very good question. You know, I grew up in Israel. I grew up as a mainstream Zionist, right? And I know very, very, very well that it's very difficult, right, to shake that off. Okay? It's very powerful. Nationalism in general is very powerful, right? But if we want to think about a future there, right, a different kind of state for everyone who's there, not a state that's based on Jewish supremacy, not a state that's based on settler colonialism, not a state that's based on the dehumanization of Palestinians, right? But a state where everyone's belonging is recognized, everyone's dignity is recognized, right? Everyone's rights, individual and collective rights, are recognized, right? Not this discourse that we've heard for years since Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, right? If you maybe some of you might remember, who said, "What, Palestinian people? But there are no Palestinian people," right? So this kind of genocidal erasure, right, in discourse, right? All this we have to come to terms with and to understand that this is not a conflict. We have a state and we have a people under occupation. If we come to terms with this history, if we face the truth, right, then we have the opportunity for a different kind of future for everyone there. Otherwise, I have to tell you, by the way, right, that the idea, and I'm telling you this as an Israeli here, right, the idea that you have a state, that the security of Jews is built on the insecurity of Palestinians, on the oppression of Palestinians, right? Has that worked? If there is a
That's not what I'm
lesson,
suggesting.
if there is a lesson from 7th of October, right, it is that this has not worked. No one's security is ensured if everyone's security is not ensured. That's a simple lesson, right? But in order to get there, we have to come to truth, to terms with documented reality, with documented facts. There's a library of research on this history. Lynn, I saw you had a...
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So Raj, you're a genocide expert. So preventing genocide kind of makes your job useless, right? But I suppose that's a job you'd like to lose. But it seems like humanity has expanded enough to understand, to be able, there's enough for everybody. But if some people aren't going to play fair, you know, they're just not going to. It doesn't matter if I hate them because they, you know, even Hitler, you know, was a baby once. I guess, you know, how do we see that this can resolve itself, you know, practically on the ground? Like having Gaza, Golan Heights, East Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, northern West Bank, southern West Bank. It's like if we divided Boulder, where I live, up like that, nobody could do anything, and it would polarize everyone everywhere. It seems like it's set up. It was set up to fail, don't you think, Raz? And don't you think maybe it was that the United States wanted a base on another continent because we were scared after we left England and we had our own country. We need others to take over.
Well, let me say, Kathy, if it's okay, I'm happy to continue beyond 10:30. I see that there's a lot of questions, and you know, if people want to stay, I'm happy to stay. And
Yeah, we can stay as long as you can stay awake since
Sure.
it's late your time. But
Sure.
people can leave whenever they
Sure.
need to go. So
Are you in Israel, Raz?
No, I live in Philadelphia.
Oh, okay.
So, look, the issue is not that simple, actually, Lynn. The issue is that after the Holocaust and the war, instead of thinking about the political systems and structures that brought us to World War II and the Holocaust, right, which is the nation-state system and white supremacy and settler colonialism, right? These are deeply anti-Semitic systems that had targeted Jews for discrimination, for persecution, ultimately for destruction in Europe, right? Instead of rethinking the political, the mainstream political arrangement of the world, right, it was reproduced, right? The nation-state system wasn't abolished, it was reproduced after World War II, right? More ethno-national homogeneity, right? I mean, think about Poland. Poland, which was a state which was very multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-religious, multilingual, became 95% Catholic Polish, right, after World War II, right? Settler colonialism and white supremacy weren't abolished, right? There was a lot of decolonial uprisings and decolonial wars, and it took time. But notice where the nation-state system and settler colonialism was reproduced together in the Israeli case, right? Israel was founded as an ethno-national state and a settler project together, right? Now, again, what does that mean? That means that the state was founded in a way that left basically no chance, right, for peace, real peace, peace that's based on the shared dignity and humanity and rights of everyone there, right? Therefore, the Nakba in 1948, right? So in order to think about all of these things, and I want to tell you this, that why do we see this kind of weaponized discourse against the encampments today in the US, right? Why? Because if we come to terms with Israeli settler colonialism, right, that might open the floodgates to come to terms really with settler colonialism everywhere, including and primarily in the US, right? And God forbid what might happen then, right? So, but there's great potential in that. And that's why the encampments, the students in the encampments, which are, by the way, very diverse. They're Jews and Christians and Muslims and Arabs and men and women and LGBTQI and Black people, right? They are showing us possible futures beyond the nation-state system, beyond settler colonialism, right?
And they're so peaceful.
I mean, I've been in the encampment in UPenn. I have many colleagues. I mean, I spoke there with Dr. Omer Bartov a few days ago, who's another Israeli Jewish Holocaust scholar. By the way, there is, on 9th of December, 60 Holocaust and genocide study scholars, 60, right, published a statement on mass violence after 7th of October in Israel and Palestine. 60 Holocaust and genocide study scholars, among them Jews and Israelis, right? So when people say, you know, Jew hater, anti-Semite, do you really think that 60 people with their professional life is devoted, right, to studying and to struggling against genocide and mass violence, right, are all somehow part of a conspiracy? Many of them Jews and Israelis like me who grew up in Israel, have family, friends, care deeply about this place, right? They're all part of a conspiracy to destroy the place? I don't think so. I see David Jacobs' hand.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Segal. I want to follow up on what you started to go into, and I want to ask a question to kind of tease a little bit differently. My question is the perception and maybe the unique perspective of the university students. And so what I'm getting a sense of is that there's a kind of a craziness of this conflict. And the craziness is partly because, or at least my observation is, the extremists of both sides are in charge of the narratives. And I believe that with the diversity that these occupations or these encampments have, that they are a little ahead of the game. They're smarter than us. They're more media savvy, more critical thinking oriented. And the storylines, the propaganda coming from both sides is not acceptable. And I think you're right. I think they may have a new way of looking at things, and there's an opportunity to listen to them carefully. But I don't think that narrative, a complex, nuanced narrative, is not coming through from the students. And that's partly my question about what's the students' perspective, the university students. I'm hearing a lot of people saying, the students are just naive.
The students aren't naive at all. Look, there's two things to say here, I think. One is I don't think that it's true that we have this idea of extremists on both sides, right? Again, I urge you, I don't know if anyone can here on the Zoom, but if you follow Israeli media and social media, mainstream media, since the 7th of October, and for that you need Hebrew, right? You have been exposed to horrific levels of genocidal language and incitement. Horrific, okay? Including calls to kill Palestinian children, outright, unashamed, and many other things. This is not an extremist view in Israel today. That's the problem. Now, there are extremists. They happen to be government ministers today, right? How did they get to be government ministers, right? And now, we can't really talk about both sides in general in this kind of way because there's no symmetry here, right? And we know that in the Palestinian case, every time that there were moderate leaderships among Palestinians that emerged, what did Israel do? Kill them. Now, it shouldn't be surprising because it was the Israeli government that actually set up Hamas basically as it is today, right? Why? Typical colonial rule, divide and rule, right? Hamas as an alternative to the Palestinian Authority to make sure that there's no unity, that there's friction, which indeed there is and there was, right? And it's what occupiers and colonial powers can do very, very effectively. Of course, sometimes, in many cases actually, and it's very important that we pay attention to colonial history here, right? This comes back to bite the colonial powers, right? This is what we're seeing now in front of our eyes in Israel. So I'm not sure that we should talk about both sides in this kind of way, and I'm not sure that we should talk about extremists in this kind of way. But to answer or to respond to your comment about the encampments, look, the students are not naive at all. Some of the students are very angry. I'm very angry. It may not show, but I'm unbelievably furious. Okay? And some of them are very angry. But they understand that one of the basically what they're doing now, the way that I interpreted it, is that they understand that we live in a world with many absurdities, as I said. And they understand that part of the struggle now is to insist all the time on the truth, right? That their campuses are complicit in Israel's genocidal assault. That now people ask, so why are they protesting about this and not this, this, and that, right? Well, because the only way that Israel's genocidal assault can continue in Gaza, right, is because of the US support, right? It's their taxpayer, it's your taxpayers' money, right? It's our taxpayers' money, right? That's why they're on their campuses. But one of the things that they're doing is that they're insisting that the truth prevails in any case, and they will throw it in our faces, whatever happens, right? And that's why their call, by the way, is not just to divest, to disclose and divest, right? They're telling their university administrators, tell us what you know and you're not telling us, and then divest from that, right? Recognize what's going on in Gaza. You have, for very good reasons, and rightly so, strongly condemned the Hamas-led attack on 7th of October, as I did, right? Very strongly, right? Do the same for Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, which many, many university administrators have not done, right? So they're insisting now, just one more thing I'll say about this, just to give you a sense of how it feels, I think. We live in an era, it's as if we are sitting outside in the middle of the day and it's broad daylight, and someone sits next to us and says, it's absolutely dark. And you say, no, it's not. It's broad daylight. And they say, no, it's absolutely dark. And that's the discussion we now need to have in some cases, right? Gary.
Yeah, thank you so much for this conversation. It's just amazing. And I think you've really touched on my question a little bit, and I appreciate it. I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The podcast, The Red Nation, a Native American podcast, comes from here. My daughter's a young Black woman here who, when George Floyd happened, everything shifted here. And my question is this: all of the narratives I see about what's happening in Gaza focus on this sort of IDF versus Hamas, and then Zionists versus Palestinians, and then this kind of weirder dialogue about all kinds of history related to Zionism and so forth. For the last 3 years, I've been working a lot with young people dealing with living with love, joy, and compassion into an extinction event. And I will say that I would love it if you could help frame this in a broader term so that the whole world can understand this isn't about Judaism. This isn't about being Jewish or Islamic or Christian. We have an ecocidal culture, and we are thriving by killing off all the other species. We've seen that. And now when we have genocide against humans, it comes right to our face. Oh, this is how we thrive. We thrive by coveting, stealing, and killing. So, and civilizations are preceded by forests and followed by wastelands. This is an old truism. Can you help frame this with a narrative that helps us to break away from, I feel like this is we're hiding behind these narratives that are commonly used in the media. I don't think this is about Judaism. I don't think it's about that. I think this is about how we humans are thriving by killing. And can you help reframe it in that? Is there a way to do that? Because Native Americans get this, believe me. Native Americans see exactly what's going on. You follow the question? Maybe I'll just let you respond. Thanks so much.
Yes,
I need to step in for a second. I'm so sorry. My name is Reverend Kristen Kriba. I'm the assistant minister here. There is continued commentary in the chat that is anti-Muslim and anti-Arab, and it feels like this has become a platform for hate. And I'm not comfortable with it. We've been trying to interact through the chat. And so I'm asking either that the chat be closed or that anyone who has participated in hateful language be removed from this forum.
Okay, I just turned off the ability to chat. So anyone who wants a question has to raise their hand.
Thank you.
Use the electronic hand raise.
Thank you, Reverend and Kathy. So Gary, yes, I think I understand your your question. I actually, last semester, I teach at Stockton University, which is a medium on the smaller size public university in southern New Jersey. No one has heard about it. But last semester in the fall, I designed and taught for the first time a graduate seminar on the intersection of climate change, global warming, environmental destruction, and genocide. And there's a lot of these intersections, and I agree with you, it's incredibly important. I mean, it's enough if we consider, by the way, very relevant to our topic, that in 40 or 50 years or 60 years, it doesn't really matter in that sense, no one will probably be able to live in Palestine, Israel, because it's a global warming hotspot. Last week in Tel Aviv, there were 42 degrees Celsius. I go by Celsius, by the way. I reject Fahrenheit completely. But there were 42 degrees Celsius, which I think is about 110, 11 Fahrenheit, something like that, right? This is April in Tel Aviv, right? There is actually incredibly important work on water, for example, in the Middle East, including in Palestine, Israel, and Syria, water wars. There's a lot of important work on these intersections, Gary, specifically in the Middle East, but in other parts of the world as well. This isn't about Judaism. This is, so again, we could talk about these intersections a lot, but we don't have time, unfortunately. It really deserves a separate talk, actually a whole seminar that I taught last semester. But I will say that this is not about Judaism in the sense that the weaponization of anti-Semitism is a discourse that is based on the collapse of the distinction between a people and a state, right? Jews and Israel. And there's a big difference between a people and a state, or if we think about a religious, world like Judaism, right? So this isn't a religious war, right? There's a religious element to it, of course, and especially if we think about Jerusalem, which is a specific case, and again, deserves a lot of separate discussion, right? There's religious elements, but this is not primarily a religious war. This is a case of settler colonialism. This is issues of nationalism, right, and of state violence. Connie?
Yeah, I see kind of a strange contradiction that I don't know exactly what to do with in my head, which is we're in the middle of an election season right now, and we face the possibility of having, the right-wing Christian nationalists under, the blessing of Trump being back in power. And then I look at who and what Christian nationalists are, and they love Israel, because Israel there's something historical for them about Israel. And I understood it at one point, but it gets me confused. So then if Trump wins, and then we've got the Christian nationalists out there, are they going to be pro-Zionists and pro-Israel? Or I don't even, where would they sit around this thing? Would they have would they be totally, yeah, we love Israel and we're going to keep supporting them? Or would they in any way, be affected by people who say, look at what the Zionists are doing? Because there's Christian Zionists. So sometimes this whole thing just, I'm trying to put it together and it doesn't fit.
Look, I think that the students in the encampments, when I say they point to different possibilities, different futures, right? They're also pointing, obviously, to the fact that the political system in the US doesn't actually speak anymore to the majority of Americans, right? Wherever they are on the political spectrum. The one thing that we're very clear about going into November, in my view, right, is that most Americans don't want Biden and don't want Trump. Now, thing is, and this is, many people who tend to vote Democrats, we know, are not going to vote for Biden in this election because they're not going to be able to vote for a president that for 6.5 months is supporting actively genocide.
Yeah, my kids feel that way.
And it raises a lot of questions, right? Why are the Democrats doing this? Why are they making these choices? Why are they willing to commit political suicide on the case of Israel? Well, it tells us something about, this triad of uniqueness, the Holocaust, Jews in Israel in the West, about the Holocaust and Jews in Israel as an issue of identity in the West. It tells us something about how white supremacy and Jewish supremacy function in the US political system. And all this deserves a lot more discussion, right? But the thing is that, we now face a situation where any choice would be terrible, actually, right? But I have to say, and I have to, I'll tell you sincerely, I just became a US citizen, by the way. I'm going on a very Jewish path. I'm collecting as many citizenships as possible. This is my third one. So, but I don't know what I'm going to do. It's going to be very difficult for me to vote for a president that has been actively supporting genocide. We know, though, that a Trump presidency will be an utter disaster around the world. For example, relevant to our discussion, we know that the isolationist tendencies of a Trump presidency, right, will probably create a situation where the Israeli government will move to a full ethnic cleansing of the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, right?
That's what I'm afraid of.
That will be horrific. Just as the assault on Gaza is horrific, that will be another horrific reality that will unfold in front of our eyes.
I know I had my question already, but I have one quick comment. I'm really I'm already, what do you call it? I'm really liking these occupations because they remind me of the Vietnam War when they had all of these huge demonstrations and people sat around and had study groups to learn about North and South Vietnam and what it was and why we were there and why we were against it. And, I get the feeling that that's some of what's going on at these.
There's a lot of learning in the encampments, indeed. A lot of learning. There's also a lot of very dangerous things like poetry reading. I don't know if you participated in poetry readings. It's very shared prayers, very, very, very dangerous.
It just reminds me of good things from that era.
Yeah. So I don't know what to say about the political situation in the US. It scares me a lot. I can tell you that when Congresswoman Green talked about the Jewish space lasers in California in relation to the forest fires, going back to Gary's question, the first thing that I did was check how long it would take me to drive to the Canadian border from Philadelphia. It's about 8 hours. We can do it. So yeah, I don't know where we need these encampments badly. Holly?
Thank you, Dr. Segal, for speaking with us and all this information you have. I was also wondering about the political thing, but I wanted to ask more about just ideas of how to approach conversations kindly and gently and compassionately when the person that you're speaking with is kind of couching things in this both sides kind of manner, or yeah, I guess I've been trying to figure out how to speak with people about that in show a different perspective.
Yeah, it's very
makes sense.
difficult. You know, you can, the first thing that I'd say is that you should devote time and energy to conversation where there's a willingness to have a conversation, right? Where there's a clear case, when there's no willingness to have a conversation, then you're wasting your time and your energy, and the time and energies are in short supply and very precious, and you shouldn't be doing that. When there is a willingness for a conversation, in many cases there is, right? Then, you know, I think that there is, as I said, a library of research on Palestine and Israel today, by Israelis, by Palestinians, by Jews, by many others. And there's a lot of much more accessible also, right? I mean, a lot of people don't have time to sit around and read long books, right? Or a lot of journal articles with a lot of, you know, political science or historical studies, professional jargon, and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of accessible writing of various kinds, in many languages, by the way, about this. That's why I mentioned, for example, The Iron Wall, the seminal essay by Zev Jabotinsky. Working with primary sources, by the way, is a very important way to engage people, right? Because people have to understand that, you know, if Jabotinsky regarded Zionism as settler colonialism, then there's probably something in that, right? It's not just an anti-Semitic thing to say that Zionism is settler colonialism, right? So, and that's why learning, indeed, and that's why, you know, coming back to this issue that I said, truth, right? There can be no peace, there can be no justice without truth. And you know, we live in an era where there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation and distortions and denials, right? But there are, in many cases, we do encounter people who are very willing to have a conversation sincerely, right? Who care, people who really care, right? People who are hateful or are not willing to have a conversation, okay. But people who do really care and come from a different position and approach, and I've encountered actually quite a lot of those since 7th of October, and I've spoken in many places, in person and on Zoom, then yes, then it's a process of learning. I sat with a student after a talk in the Freedom School. It's another project that the students in UPenn had back in November. Religious Jewish student came, very different approach, very different person. He sat down and listened to everything that I had to say, and then he came to me afterwards, and we sat together for an hour and a half, right? I wasn't planning on staying so long after, but we sat for an hour and a half, and it was this kind of session of learning. He told me how he understands, what are his sources of knowledge, right? What are his experiences? So it's just one person, right? But I thought that it was worthwhile because he did seem to be willing to have a conversation. He cared, and he did understand that there's something there that he needs to, you know, open up to, right? And I also understood that there's something there that I need to open up to, actually, right? To his position and to his approach, right? But truth is fundamental, right? So unfortunately, it's not much, but that's what I have to say about this. And Linda?
Thank you. I feel really privileged to be able to hear you not just on pre-recorded videos, but to hear you responding to people extemporaneously and really engaging. I really respect what you're doing and how you're doing it. I had a question about I find myself irritated every time I read headlines looking for more, you know, what the latest is from a variety of news sources. and all use this stock phrase pro-Palestinian. And it seems like even those who are not necessarily, news sources that aren't necessarily critical of the protesters, but this framing of pro-Palestinian so I guess my question is, ultimately, to what degree do you think, from where you stand, the US press and what you've observed is sort of pre-programmed to just slot into these shorthands rather than doing the real work of calling, like, the protesters anti-genocide, for example? Um, it just seems it's such a disturbing, to me, way in which the framing, as if we were talking about like Chelsea versus Arsenal or something, which side are you on? When really what's being protested is, is the slaughter of people, whoever those people might be, among, I think, so many of the protesters. So I guess my question is, to what degree you think that maybe that's is it a battle worth fighting, or is it something to try to even influence the media framing, or is that sort of a lost cause? Thanks.
Well, thank you. The U.S. media, is an animal, is a very strange animal. And I mean, the thing is that there are also, there's a lot of information out there, obviously, when we live in this, social media age. So there's a lot of sources of information, and if, yes, sometimes you need to go looking for,
Your voice is fading and we don't hear anything. I don't know if you
Oh,
can get closer to the mic or whatever.
sorry.
Thank
I said that sometimes you need to go looking for specific outlets, or radio shows, or you know that provide more complex perspective, or, as you said, Linda, right, it's not this kind of, you know whose side are you on. It also means, right, that that if you're an Israeli Jew or a Palestinian, then you can comment on this, but no one else can, really, right? Even though, as I said, it really concerns the U.S. very, very much, in very real ways. Um, so, I think that mainstream media is what it is, right? Um, but there are many other sources that we can look to. And again, this is one of the things, Dr. Omer Bartov and I were at UPenn, as I said, talking about anti-Semitism and its weaponization, right? And then we walked over to the encampment, and you can see that the students, and this is really admirable and remarkable, they are very curious. They're there to learn. They ask terrific questions, right? They want to understand. They admit when they don't know things, right? And that in itself, so, it's easy to tune into CNN, or for that matter to Al Jazeera, right? I mean, or right, and that's it. And I know that people sometimes whole days just listen to Al Jazeera or listen to CNN or whatever it is, right? But to really learning is hard, right? I mean, learning is really hard, uh, and it's destabilizing, if it's done right, right? And it's confusing. That's why my pedagogical approach, and I tell this to students always, is productive confusion. My goal is that at the end of a class, at the end of a course, everyone is really confused, right? Including myself, asking new questions, unclear, right? Looking for new sources of information. That's learning. It's difficult. A lot of people don't want to do it. A lot of people don't have time to do it, right? And that's again why the encampments are so important, because, as some of you have commented and said, they are really sites of learning, right? Which is incredible these days. Let's go for let's say another 10 minutes, and then okay, so we have Shira, Caitlin, Kathy, and then Robin. So I suggest this. maybe we take all the questions now. So Shira, Caitlin, Kathy, and Robin, we take them, and then I'll respond to them together as much as I can. Okay?
And so please be as brief as you can.
All right, thank you. And yeah, first of all, I'm speaking as a someone who has lobbied my Congressman Raskin for a ceasefire. I was in a ceasefire circle for a while, and I'm a ceasefire activist in other ways. But one thing I'm learning is to view this issue and other single issues I'm working on in the broad context of what is going on in our society with the threat of a takeover by Trump. I am convinced that if he gets elected, we will wind up in a theocratic police state dictatorship. And there are some real parallels with what's going on now and with what's going on with Nazi Germany. So anyway, my point is, I'm getting to a question now. My point is that I've made a really agonizing decision about voting, and that I'm going to be voting for Biden, because I am, there's some real parallels here with the Holocaust, and I am convinced that if Trump gets in, the only way any of us are going to be able to survive is to leave the country or go underground. So I've made that very agonizing decision to vote Democratic. And so I guess, Dr. Segal, I just am curious about what your thoughts are about this type of decision in relation to what's going on in Gaza.
Thank you, Shira. Caitlin?
Hi. So I have been watching the encampment at Columbia for a while, and I just checked in briefly while we're talking, and they're getting destroyed. They're getting beaten up right now. And I hear you, and I believe you that these encampments are so important, but I'm also a mom of an 11-year-old who I don't want to see get beaten up in 8 years. And I'm wondering, you know, as adults, because I think sometimes we're like, yay, the encampments, and we put too much on the kids, you know, they're vulnerable, they have student debt. I'm wondering, as adults, what do we need to do to stop this genocide and to support these students? You know, what do you see as the most important actions right now to take? Because I feel like I've been lost in an ocean of possible actions that all seem futile or scary.
Thank you, Caitlin. Kathy?
Yeah, that's Kathy Radinovsky.
Yes, Kathy, go ahead.
My question is, there's no question that the United States is complicit, and the weapons there have the U.S. on them. What is the legal consequence for being complicit? Is something written in the genocidal law or whatever? You know, we are going to be punished, but can we be legally punished? That's it. Next question.
Robin?
I think one of my questions got asked, but just to understand, I always classify myself as a learner because I'm just so new to the game, even though I'm old. But you said, Doctor, that educating yourself is very confusing, but that's not to say that truth is confusing. Truth is hard, but it still is the truth. I mean, I feel like I can hear the truth. I mean, it just rings in my heart. What you're saying rings in my heart. But there's still going to be confusion as I learn. I'm wondering if that's correct. And I thank you very much for your time.
So I'll just very briefly, Caitlin, I'm also Caitlin. Oh, there you are. I'm a dad for an 11-year-old daughter, so who's upstairs sleeping, probably listening to this, but anyway. um, uh, and I think, you know, you ask what could we do? I mean, kids are vulnerable, but there is so I'll say a couple of very brief things. One, kids are vulnerable. Of course, adults are also vulnerable, but kids are very vulnerable, but there is a generational, I mean, in terms of when we think about learning, also asking new kinds of questions. I mean, there is a generational thing that sometimes a new generation can ask questions, and really learning is all driven by questions, right? Ask questions that we can't even imagine, right? So we really need them. We really, really need them. In some sense, teaching is really teaching how to ask questions, right? That's, I mean, in a way. But what to do, right? So I spoke a bit about truth here and there, and as I said, I know it's not much, and having a discussion with someone to insist that it's daylight now could be unbelievably frustrating, right? And strangely time-consuming. But there is something that we can do actually, practically, and is in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our involvement in the world around us in various ways, politically or otherwise. We can work towards boycott and sanctions and divestment, which is a long, long project, well before 7th of October. It's been vilified, it's been attacked, right? Again, the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And that's also part of the encampments, of course, right? That demand to disclose and divest. We can all do that in various ways as well and participate in that. Also in relation to the upcoming elections, by the way. So I urge you to, I mean, there's a lot about that actually, about BDS in various ways. There's a lot of people who are doing that in the academic world, in the business world, with companies, within companies, in their own places of employment, right? There's a lot about it. And of course, after 7th of October, much, much more, because people suddenly, saw that, oh, this isn't actually anti-Semitism, right? So so that's something we can all actually do. And I urge all of us to seek, and again, we have to, people have gained a lot of experience doing that over the years, right? So seek people in your communities who have done this and see how you can help, how you can contribute. And there's definitely ways that you can, because everyone is overburdened, no one has time, and so on and so forth. So that's about what we can do. And I'll just say one more thing about confusion and truth. First, I do think that truth can be confusing, actually, right? Because it really depends on where the person is coming from, right? But confusion is in the process, right, of learning and engaging in the world. And I can tell you, I mean, again, in response to this kind of more personal question about, how I grew up mainstream Zionism and became who I am, right? Which is a long, long story that we don't have time for. But it's through a lot of confusion, right? and engagement in various ways, right, with things that I didn't want to engage with, basically, right, and resistance and these kinds of things. So this, I mean, it's a good note to end on, actually, right? We live in a very scary time, I agree, and a very challenging time. But there have been in recent history and in not so recent history other periods that were scary and challenging to the people who lived in those times, right? And so I urge all of us to really jump into confusion, right, and into learning and into engagement, especially if it's things that cause us to be uncomfortable, right? We really need this engagement today. And again, if you seek those people and opportunities to engage in BDS, for example, I assure you that you will encounter some uncomfortable interactions, for example, right? From whatever position you're coming from, right? So it's very, very important to insist on that and to walk on this path towards truth. The situation is horrible, right? But there are opportunities and possibilities beyond it. Thank you, everyone, for your questions, for your engagement, for listening. Really appreciate it a lot.
Yes, thanks everyone for coming. I just wanted to mention, I put it in the chat. Our next event is May 19th. It's an in-person event. I don't think we can make it hybrid, but we'll probably try to record it. It's called Waking from the Dream of Zionism with Rabbi Alexis Pierce. It's May 19th, that's a Sunday, 11:30 a.m. at the Common Room of First UU Church of San Diego. So I'll send that information to everyone who is registered here, as well as the link to the recording of this event. So thanks, everyone. We need to let Dr. Segal go to bed here, I think. So
Thanks,
very,
Kathy.
very late. Thank you.
I'm Unitarian, and all of our Segals, 7 sisters, went to San Diego. It's sort of interesting that I hooked up with you. I'm glad I did. How can I get the recording?
So I'm going to send it.
I missed the first half hour.
Oh, okay. I'm going to send the recording in a link to everyone who's registered. And it'll be up on YouTube. So I will do that. So thanks, everybody.
Is there anybody we can trust to make donations that would, knowing they would actually get to Gaza to help with the famine? Because I mean,
I think
that's what a lot of people are just trying to imagine.
So I've heard Anera is a good one to donate to. What's that? Anera is the American Near East Refugee, something like that. I don't know. But okay, so I guess Dr. Segal has signed off, has he? Well, thank you everybody for sticking with us for so long, and take care.
And so the next one,
oh, thanks, Naomi.
do you know when the recording will be available?
It should be by tomorrow.
Send it out.
I'll send it out, yeah. But it should be by tomorrow or the day after or something.
And in May, you may or may not be hybrid. You don't know.
Yeah, we don't know if we can swing that, but we'll probably try to record it and put it on YouTube as well. So if you're interested in that, well, you can respond to the email that you get from, so we can figure out something to do to get, so people can watch that.
Thank you and good night. Thank you.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks again.
Thanks for putting this together.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone.